سر تو بریده طالب، سر من بریده اندوه. به کجا برم شکایت؟ وطنی که سر ندارد، وطنی که جز بخونم نظری به من ندارد. ز جنون خونگساری غم خیر و شر ندارد، غم خیر و شر ندارد. وطنی که سر ندارد. سهر ندارد.
بینندگان عزیز تلویزیون، ما یکی از فامیل کارزار دفاع از مبارزات مردم ایران در ونکوور کانادا آکسیونی رو در همبستگی با مردم ستمدیده افغانستان به ویژه زنان و کودکان این کشور که با بازگشت طالبان روزهای سیاه‌تری در انتظارشون خواهد برگزار کردیم و سخنرانانی داشتیم از جامعه افغانستان و فعالین ایرانی شب یا سخنرانی کردیم. ما تو زبان فارسی ضرب المثلی داریم میگه که کس نخواهد پشت من جز ناخن انگشت من. نمیدونم عزیزان افغان هم این ضرب المثل دارن یا نه، ولی این تراژدی که با بازگشت طالبان در 2 هفته اخیر شاهدش بودیم، این تراژدی در این 2 هفته رخ نداد. 4 دهه است که مردم افغانستان، اکثریت زحمتکش و زنان ستمدیده افغانستان به دنبال کودتا و جنگ و اشغال نظامی توسط نیروهای مختلف از جهادیون اسلامی گرفته، مسئول ارتش شوروی گرفته، بعد از اون که جهادیون اسلامی اومدن با کمک سازمان سیاه و حکومت عربستان و حمایت‌های ایران و پاکستان و حمایت‌های همه نهادهای غربی به قدرت رسیدن و بعد که یک نظام اسلامی رو اینجا حاکم کردن و خودشون هم با هم دعوا داشتن و با جنگ داخلی که با هم داشتن، طالبان از اون موقعیت استفاده کرد. طالبانی که در مدارس دینی پاکستان باز با پول امن عربستان و با کمک پاکستان، یعنی 2 متحد امریکا، اومدن و در سال 1996 افغانستان رو به اصطلاح بخش عمده افغانستان رو گرفتن، از جمله پایتخت کابل. وقتی اونا به قدرت رسیدن، آمریکا و بسیاری از کشورهای جهان مشکلی با قوانین فاشیستی مذهبی که اونا اونجا حاکم می‌کردن نداشت. تنها بعد از اینکه القاعده اومد در 11 سپتامبر 2001 به برخی مراکز آمریکا حمله کرد، حمله تروریستی کرد، اون موقع بوده که آمریکا و متحدینش تصمیم گرفتن طالبان رو برگردن. در طول این 20 سالی که آمریکا و متحدینش در افغانستان وجود داشتن، آمار میگه که حدود 180,000 نفر کشته شدن. 50,000 نفر طالبان بودن، حدود 70,000 نفر نیروهای امنیتی خود دولت فاسد و درمانده به اصطلاح افغانستان بود و 4,000 نفر نیروهای آمریکا و متحدینش. اما بیش از 50,000 نفر افراد غیر نظامی بودند که اکثریتشون زنان و کودکان بودند. سازمان نجات بین‌المللی نجات کودکان اخیراً آمار داده که در طول این 20 سال 33,000 کودک یا کشته شدن یا معلول شدن، یعنی در هر 5 ساعت یک کودک یا کشته شده یا معلول شده. اینکه چند میلیون افغان به خاطر جنگ یا به خاطر فقر و عدم امنیت به کشورهای مجاور یا کشورهای دیگه فرار کردن و پناهنده شدن و افغانستان رو به عنوان سومین کشوره که به لحاظ میزان پناهجویان و آوارگان قرار داده، اونم رو ما باید در نظر بگیریم. همه این مسائل چی رو ثابت می‌کنه؟ این رو ثابت میکنه که با جنگ، با کودتا، با اشغال نظامی، با تحریم اقتصادی و البته با حکومت اسلامگرای فاشیستی مذهبی نمیشه مردم یک کشور به سوی آزادی و دموکراسی هدایت بشه. امر آزادی، دموکراسی، عدالت اجتماعی امر اکثریت عظیم مردمه که از طریق جنبش خودشون، اراده خودشون و انقلاب خودشون باید متحقق بشه. درسته که در شرایط کنونی صدای سوم، یعنی صدایی که هم با اسلامگرایان، هم با امپریالیست‌های شرق و غرب، هم با دولت‌های فاسد به اصطلاح خود افغانستان و همچنین حکومت فعلی طالبان و رژیم‌های ارتجاعی ایران و پاکستان و عربستان و غیره مرزبندی بکنه، یک اقلیتی هستند در خود جامعه افغانستان، اما تنها نیرویی هستند که میتونن در سپهر سیاسی افغانستان افق رهایی واقعی رو برای اکثریت مردم به ارمغان بیارن. خوشبختانه با اون که 2 هفته از حکومت طالبان بیشتر نگذشته، شاهد آغاز مقاومت مردم افغانستان هستیم در شهرهای مختلف، از جمله در شهر هرات. زنان 2 هفته بعد از بازگشت طالبان با برپایی یک تظاهرات با شعار نان، کار، امنیت حق مسلم ماست، اراده خودشون رو به نمایش گذاشتن. ما بار دیگه همبستگی خودمون رو با مردم ستمدیده افغانستان به ویژه زنان اعلام میکنیم و امیدواریم که صدای سوم، صدای نیروهای مترقی، مستقل، چپ و آزادیخواه روز به روز قوی تر بشه. در راستای این پیکار نفسگیر ما ایرانیان چپ و آزاده و همه انسان‌های مترقی جهان در کنار مردم افغانستان، در کنار زحمتکشان افغانستان، به ویژه در کنار زنان ستمدیده افغانستان خواهیم. درود بر شما.
Good afternoon. My name is Parveen Ashrafi, and on behalf of Campaign to Defend People's Struggle in Iran, I would like to salute you and welcome you for being here today with us. First of all, I would like to acknowledge that we are standing on the indigenous stolen land. We gathered here to stand in solidarity with Afghanistan toiling and oppressed people. Friends, for years, we echoed the third voice and spoke out against the US NATO occupation, and now that it has ended, the Taliban are back. In the past 20 years, one of our demands was an end to the US NATO occupation, and even better, if they take their Islamic fundamentalists and technocrats with them and let the people of Afghanistan decide for themselves, for their own fate.
Yes.
The occupation only resulted in bloodshed, destruction, and chaos. They turned the country into the most corrupt, insecure, drug mafia, and dangerous place, especially for women.
Shame.
It is a joke to say values like women's rights, democracy, nation building, etc. were part of the US NATO aims in Afghanistan. It wasn't. the very beginning, we could predict such an outcome. We knew that the continuation of US attacks and the increase in the number of the innocent civilian victims not only gives an excuse to the Taliban, but also would cause the empowerment of the political Islam forces in the region and even in the world. And the so-called peace talks paved the way to bring Taliban back, one of the other Islamic forces, to the power again. From the very first days when the Northern Alliance looters and killers were installed back into power in 2002, to the last so-called peace talks, the deal and agreement in Doha to hand over Afghanistan to Taliban and release of 5,000 terrorists from prisons in 2020 and 2021, it was very obvious that even the withdrawal won't have a good end. In fact, the policymakers were forced to withdraw troops to focus on their own internal burning issues like a COVID pandemic, attack on Capitol Hill, and the great protests of US public in the past few years. Protests like Black Lives Matter and Can't Breathe and so on. Another reason is that the Afghan war was an exceptionally expensive war whose cost has gone into trillions, all taken from taxpayer money. This put such a heavy dent on the US financially that it had to leave Afghanistan. The warmongering policies proved that their aim was never, ever to make Afghanistan safer, let alone now when they are leaving. And all over in society, growing corruption, injustice, unemployment, insecurity, fraud, vast poverty, drug and smuggling, etc., provided a ground for re-emergence of Taliban as well. Now Afghanistan is in the limelight again due to the Taliban being in power again. But this has been the situation for the past 20 years. And every day, hundreds of people were killed and the country destroyed. It just was rarely reported in the media. Shame and corporate media. Shame. I will stop here and ask our first speaker to join us and to share her ideas and thoughts with us. I would like to ask Arisa Carvin from Solong, UBC student, to join us. Before that, we will chant some. Okay, go. Sorry.
After 20 years occupation by United States allied, finally they unleashed Taliban terrorist group against Afghanistan people and destroyed civilization. Free Afghanistan! Free Afghanistan! Free Afghanistan! Free Afghanistan! Free Afghanistan! Free Afghanistan! Hey, hey! Ho, ho! Taliban Emirate has got to go! Hey, hey! Ho, ho! Taliban Emirate has to go! Hey, hey! Ho, ho! Taliban Emirate has got to go! Hey, hey! Ho, ho! Taliban Emirate has got to go! Free Afghanistan! Free Afghanistan! Free Afghanistan! Free Afghanistan! Down with Taliban from Kabul to Tehran! Down with Taliban from Kabul to Tehran! Free Afghanistan!
Warm greetings to the people of Afghanistan from all progressive Filipino forces as we gather here to defend your struggle for liberation and democracy. We have learned about your struggle from many quarters, from the conservative mainstream media which paints Afghan people as either helpless victims or as terrorists, to academics hemming and hawing about the situation in Afghanistan, to the Afghan people themselves telling us the truth about their lives. We have learned from you that the United States and Canadian armed forces have contributed to the violence in your country by bombing your cities, by funding the Taliban, by propping up a puppet regime which does nothing but line the pockets of foreign elites.
Yes.
We have learned that your people have resisted imperialist forces during the long 20-year military occupation, which the Canadians euphemistically call the Afghan mission, but which we know to have been a project of wealth extraction and violent counterinsurgency. The Philippines, like Afghanistan, is characterized by a puppet regime propped up by foreign military aid. The Canadian government sends money and fighter jets to the Philippine armed forces who use these to bomb indigenous schools, which they claim falsely are hotbeds for terrorist organizing. Meanwhile, the Canadian military expended billions of dollars to maintain its military presence in Afghanistan during the occupation using the same rationale. Canadian resource extraction companies like OceanaGold rely on the Philippine police to bulldoze indigenous lands to build their mines. In Afghanistan, Canadian investor Kilo Gold Mines was awarded a massive iron mining contract concession in Hajagak, the largest iron oxide deposit in Afghanistan. In the Philippines, our utilities are run by private companies for foreign profit, just as in Afghanistan, energy, construction, telecommunications industries and contracts are awarded to US, British, and Canadian companies. Our country was occupied for many centuries by colonizing forces and to this day is dotted with US military bases. US-backed militarization, as well as the semi-feudal and semi-colonial system in our country, has contributed to a patriarchal society where violence against women and against LGBTQ people runs rampant, just as is the case in Afghanistan. But while here, North American elites wring their hands about patriarchal violence in Afghanistan and use it as an excuse to justify imperialist incursions in sovereign Afghan territory, we, the Filipino women and LGBTQ people, know that US imperialism is as much your enemy as it is ours. We stand firm with the Afghan people in struggling against both the oppressive Taliban regime and foreign imperialists who wish to exploit your lands and your people for profit. We reject the popular narrative that a US-backed neoliberal regime is the only alternative to the Taliban forces. Instead, we support the Afghan people themselves in uniting for liberation and a genuine people's democracy. From Afghanistan to the Philippines, stop the US war machine! From Afghanistan to the Philippines, stop the US war machine! Long live international solidarity! Long live international solidarity!
Appreciate it. That was a great speech. Thank you so much. How about if we chant a little bit more to the next speaker, okay? So, I would say, Taliban are back, what do we do? Stand up, fight back. Okay, Taliban are back, what do we do?
Stand up, fight back!
Taliban are back, what do we do?
Stand up, fight back!
Taliban are back, what do we do?
Stand up, fight back!
Women rights under attack, what do we do?
Stand up, fight back!
Queers rights are under attack, what do we do?
Stand up, fight back!
Women's rights are under attack, what do we do?
Stand up, fight back!
Queers rights under attack, what do we do?
Stand up, fight back!
it's interesting that Taliban leadership are saying they will respect women's rights as long as it complies with Islamic law. Some Western media are painting this in a positive light. Didn't the Taliban say the same thing 20 years ago? Do you think there is any change in their attitude towards human rights and women's rights? No. The corporate media is only trying to put salt on Afghan people's wound. And this is a shame. Even the Taliban spokesperson declared that there is no difference between their ideology of 1996 and today. And what they say about women's rights is the exact phrases used during their previous dark rule, which is implementing Sharia law. No to Sharia law from Kabul to Tehran. No to Sharia law from Kabul to Tehran. No to Sharia law from Kabul to Tehran.
Free Afghanistan! Free Afghanistan! Free Afghanistan! Hey, hey! Ho, ho! Taliban imarat has got to go!
شهره قنبری. She is also an active member with campaign to defend people's struggle in Iran. She is a former political prisoner that spent over 8 years in prison in Iran. She is also an activist, an outspoken person with in the injustice movement to bring the Islamic Republic of Iran to justice for the murder and crimes they have committed for over the last 42 years. Please give a warm welcome to Shohreh Qambari.
Dear friends, today we are gathered here to protest the takeover of the Afghanistan by the Taliban and to show our solidarity with Afghan people. Among the many victims of the Taliban's return to power, Afghan women are top of the mind. For those who may not remember, it was 30 years ago when Islamic jihadists backed by the CIA, the Pentagon, and the Pakistani army with the funding from the region petrodollars were able to overthrow Najibullah's government and conquer Kabul following the withdrawal of the Soviet army. At the time, there was no doubt that the coalition of the Islamic parties with their enforcement of the Sharia law would lead to violation of the rights of women and secular intellectuals and non-Muslim minorities. The ensuing civil war for the power between the Islamic parties resulted in the women and children suffering the most. Because of this civil war, the Taliban was able to conquer Kabul in 1996 and took control of the large part of the Afghanistan. For the next 5 years, Afghanistan fell under the fascist rule, with the Taliban carrying out attack after attack on the rights of women, children, and dissidents. And during this time, where was the rest of the world? The West and 2 US allies in the regime, Pakistan and Saudi Arabia, appeased this government. It was only after Al-Qaeda on September 11, 2001 that the United States and their allies decided to launch an attack to overthrow the Taliban, ultimately succeeding and implementing their puppet government led by Hamid Karzai. And for 20 long years of US occupations and military presence in Afghanistan, tens of thousands of the civilians, especially women and children, have been killed by both NATO forces and the corrupted and looting government of Karzai, Ashraf Ghani, as well as by Islamist Taliban, ISIS, and the Haqqani network. After 20 years, what do we have to show? What we have to do? This never-ending war did not result in the defeat of the Taliban, but instead led them to return to power. And this was entirely predictable. I repeat it, this was predictable. As we, the left, progressive, and secular forces in favor of the third voice, have said many times, freedom and equality cannot be brought to the people of the other countries through coups, wars, occupation, economic sanction, and etc. and etc. Only a movement based on the will of the majority of the oppressed can end murder, misery, discrimination, corruption, and religious fanaticism. Although Afghan women in the Islamic Republic of Karzai and Ashraf Ghani suffer severely from the discrimination and inequality, everyone knows that the situation will worsen with the return of the Taliban Islamic Emirate. Now a wave of the fear and anxiety has swept through the millions of the women in Afghanistan. But the oppressed Afghan women and people during the 4 decades of the war and destruction and all kinds of the foreign intervention must have learned that no force can save them but just relying on their own strength. And it is here where the experience of the women movement in Iran can be informative. Some of you may already know, and to others, this may be new information. But the first Taliban government was born in Iran in 1979. The Iranian Taliban, led by Khomeini and then now by Khamenei, have always wanted to exclude Iranian women from society. 3 weeks after the revolution, they issued a mandatory hijab order, sprayed acid or razor on the women's faces, flogged and stoned their body, and executed thousands of women in prison. They also tried to impose various obstacles on the women in the field of the employment, education, art, music, and political and social participation. But the women's movement and other social movements were able to prevent the implementation of the many highly reactionary and fundamentalist goals of the Islamic Republic of Iran. This resistance and struggle is still going on. We believe that the freedom-loving and secular men and women of Afghanistan can also stand up to the Taliban and the religion and reactionary tradition of the patriarchal society of the Afghanistan by setting up a movement and resistance. A new generation of the free women and girls has emerged within and outside Afghanistan who are able to shape a better future for their country through the struggle rather than dependent on the foreign governments. And so as we look to Afghanistan, we collectively hold our breath. To our Afghan sisters and brothers, we defenders of the women's movement, progressive and the left of Iran and the world, we will stand by you. We believe on you. From the Kaiser. Thank you.
Thank you. He's saying something for us regarding of this matter, occupation by, USA, then, transferred to Taliban terrorist group, and then he is here for the international solidarity. Long live international solidarity!
Long live international solidarity!
Our friend Asad from Afghanistan talking to you, and we later on we briefly translate to you in English.
درود و عرض ادب. تشکر میکنم از سپورت شما که امروز از مردم رنجیده و براکشیده مردم افغانستان پشتیبانی خود را اعلان نمودید. امروز باز بعد از 20 سال طالبان سیادل و سیاکار و سیاروز دوباره با کمک ارتجاع به قدرت رسیدند. هدف از این سیادلان و سیاکوران بجز سرنگونی آزادی و مخصوصاً آزادی زنها و خانمها در افغانستان. تمام ما امید و آرزوی ما به این است که تمام جهان اینا را سپورت نکنند و به ضد اینها در همه جا تظاهرات را برا بیندازند تا مردم افغانستان از این سیادلان و سیاکوران آزادی خود را دوباره حاصل نمایند. تشکر میکنم از سپورت همه شما. تشکر.
Yeah, from Afghanistan to Iran, from Philippines, from sea to the river, everywhere, we stand up against Taliban. We oppose Taliban reactionary regime in Afghanistan, in Iran, in any country that is ruled by political Islam. Our next speaker it's worth mentioning that the United States and the West have tried 20 years to keep Afghanistan a consumer country and have consumer country and have hindered the growth of industry. This situation created a wave of unemployment and poverty, paving the way to the recruitment of the puppet government, the Taliban, and growth of opium production. Our next speaker is Eri Mastro from BC Migrante. She's very known to us and she's supporting us. She's actually present in every protest action against injustice. Please give a warm welcome to Eri Mastro.
Hello, good evening. I see people who are walking on the pavement. Please, you can stop, walk a little bit slower, and listen to the speeches and read the placards, because these are things that you will not hear on CBC or on the mainstream media. Yeah. So you are getting fresh news as it happens.
Yes.
We stand here, thousands and thousands of miles away from Afghanistan, but we're here to stand in solidarity with the people of Afghanistan, especially the Afghan women. Afghanistan, the land and its people, continues to be witness and victim to the many military interventions, military incursions, and occupation, not just by the United States and NATO countries, but also by the Soviets, the local warlords, and the Taliban. Saudi Arabia. The lessons are here. Wars of intervention, military occupation do not solve social, economic, and political problems. They make it worse for the people. And even the U.S. could not sustain its occupation of 2 decades, 20 years over a sovereign nation. The very quick takeover of the Taliban of the capital city of Kabul, even before the U.S. could complete its scheduled evacuation, was something that the U.S. apparently did not anticipate, or even Canada, or many people around the globe. It caught the U.S. and Canada by surprise. It meant that they did not read the signs. They did not listen to the people on the ground. They listened more to the bureaucrats and capitalist interests. It is well known and acknowledged that it is the women and the children who are the foremost victims and casualties of military wars and occupation, the first victims of abuse. And what are wars? They are nothing but the patriarchal and most destructive of all power abusers.
Yes.
We see this not only in war, but in the context of poverty, illiteracy, violence, and repression. I heard and read of the first organized protest in Afghanistan after the Taliban took power. The women organized the first protest in Western Herat province in Afghanistan. They took to the streets. They were in the front lines demanding their right to work, to employment, and to education. These are the women who are in the streets setting the tone that these were their rights and that they should not be clawed back and that these are rights that they are determined to defend. So you see the women who are in the forefront of the struggle. The vacuum left by the U.S. after 20 years in Afghanistan has already been filled by the Taliban and other warlords, and more likely than not will welcome the big capitalist interests to replace those of the U.S. and they will be there to plunder and exploit Afghanistan land and resources. The Afghan people know this. They have lived and suffered through this. They have the lived historical experience that under the Taliban they know it is unlikely that the Taliban will rule with kindness and compassion. They know all of that. It is highly unlikely that the Taliban will rule in the interests of the Afghanistan people. And so when the Afghan women stand for human rights, they carry their placards and they shout, "No to Taliban." They know exactly what it is they are in right now. As progressive forces around the world, and I see women here listening and taking their time to walk through the rally. As progressive forces around the world, we know how important international solidarity is to the struggles of people fighting for liberation and freedom. We also know, as one sister to another, how important it is to have revolutionary sisterhood. We will continue to be vigilant. We will continue to keep watch. And so I say, long live international solidarity. Long live the Afghan people.
Long live international solidarity.
Long live international solidarity.
Free Afghanistan.
You know what? Maybe after a few months, Taliban would say that we will hold elections. But Taliban will never change their true nature and will still be Islamic regime, misogynist regime, inhumane, barbaric, reactionary, anti-freedom, and anti-progressive. We have election in Iran. We are being ruled by Islamic regime. But what kind of election we have in Iran? A person whose hand is bloody, murdered thousands of political prisoners in Iran, came to the power by election, so-called election. So we don't buy Taliban election as well. Taliban will never change. Today, Afghan women in Herat, one of the biggest cities in Afghanistan, had organized a protest rally against Taliban. They put out a progressive, revolutionary declaration. I want to share some of their, points of the declaration with you guys here, now that we have time. This rally was organized by women, of course. They said, during last few weeks, we have been denied accessing to the public and private sectors. Our active presence in the society has been denied with restrictions. We demand right to work and education, right to presence in all aspects of the society, including social and political activities. Yes. Right to freedom, security on the streets, right to leadership to all levels of the society. Yes. We worked so hard for years to achieve these rights. It is impossible for us to ignore them. We don't accept any restrictions to fulfill our demands. How is it possible such demands be met by passing those Sharia laws that do not value human dignity and women's rights at all? Finally, the experience has shown that elimination of women for any reason, anywhere, leads to the downfall or collapse of the society. Yeah. Before we close, I would like to share one more thing with you guys. And it is interesting that puppet regime of Hamid Karzai and Ashraf Ghani were calling Taliban dissatisfied brothers for years. Okay, this was Karzai and Ghani, but how about Miss Monsef? How many of you guys heard that last week Maryam Monsef, the Liberal Party Minister for Women and Gender Equality, called the Taliban our brothers? Shame! What a shame! And when she got caught on this, she justified it and said that it was a cultural reference. What cultural reference was she making to? She's originally an Afghan woman, but it looks like she has no clue of what women of Afghanistan went through and is still going through under these brothers of her. So shame on Liberal Party, shame on their representative as women, rights minister. This is a shame. We oppose it. We should write statements. We should write, letters to them and oppose it. Taliban were never our brothers ever. They are anti-women. They are, again queers, again women, again workers, again any progressive activities within the country. Not just in Afghanistan, anywhere. They have their brothers anywhere in other countries as well. Just look in Saudi Arabia that women are beheaded because they don't cover their head. So we have this problem in many countries, but we have other side too. This is the struggle of people around the world. This is the people that are opposing this injustice that is happening in Afghanistan, in Iran, in Philippines, in Palestine, anywhere else, you name it. So that's why here we need each other, we need to support each other, we need to come together and fight back strongly together. We people united will never be defeated. People united will never be defeated. People united will never be beaten. Thank you so much for coming.